So let's go ahead and start looking at 10.3 in this lecture and look at how the president actually gets things done. Because you might have noticed in our discussion in 10.2, the office of the presidency is not quite as awe-inspiring and all-powerful as you might have thought when you were a child, or as a lot of Americans think because they don't know what's going on in our government. But as we said, the president has a very limited number of clearly defined powers. There are a few that are loosely defined, and they do offer a few loopholes per se. But when it comes to getting legislation passed, let's use that example or that scenario. The president has no vote in Congress. The president has no authority in Congress. The president cannot threaten the legislature to have them removed. The president has no say over who's on committees, who gets to be a chair of a committee, any of that. This isn't Parliament. It's totally out of the president's hands. The president can't even tell the political party who's to be a candidate in the next election for a certain seat in the Congress. It's up to us, the voters, and primaries and such. So if the president has really no ability to manipulate the legislature, and as we said the last time, there's no guarantee that the president's own party is going to be in control of the legislature. How is the president supposed to accomplish anything? Well, it comes down to the power of persuasion. And I have to emphasize it has to be that power because the president has no coercive power. He can't affect your job. Try as he might, there's no way that President Trump can remove Nancy Pelosi from office. Try as he might, there's no way that he can get a certain member of the Republican Party removed from office if he doesn't like them. He doesn't have that ability. He does have the ability, though, to try and build a coalition, convince people, win people over, beg, borrow, and steal, so to speak. There are ways, but he can't actually force anyone to do anything. So it's all down to the power of persuasion. Now, the president does have one ace up his sleeve before we go into this discussion. He and the vice president, can't forget the vice president, he and the vice president are the only officials that are voted on by the entire country. They're the only men in America who can stand up and say that they truly represent the people, so to speak. And so the president can sort of take that mandate, if you will, and try and build a truly national constituency to win over support. The president also does have another advantage over a lot of other politicians. A lot of his job is actually ceremonial. A lot of his job is ritual. He doesn't have a clearly defined responsibility in a lot of areas, so he's doing a lot of, as we've seen recently, speeches from the Rose Garden, updates, this, that, the briefings. The president doesn't have to do that. There's no reason that Donald Trump does that. Well, let me rephrase that. There's no legal reason. It's not like he has to. It's not like the CDC said, Don, you've got to read this. He is out there doing that because he is trying to get on TV and remind people that he's helping fight it and he's taking in all the, he's trying to put himself in the situation, right? And paint himself in a positive light. He's got that flexibility, A lot of politicians don't have that. They have a clearly defined job, and there'd be no reason for them to be up there. Try as he might, the secretary of, I don't know, whatever, he can't justify going up and giving a briefing, right? So that is another thing. Not only does the president have the ability to claim a national audience or a national constituency, but because he and the vice president have largely ceremonial jobs, they have the flexibility to kind of move around and be where they want to be and put themselves in positions that benefit them. I do have to point out, though, there is a shot clock. Basically, as a president, you have got a narrow window in your first term to get things done for several reasons, as we shall see. And then your second term, you have lost actually one of your great cards, or one of your great levers, which is that whole "I'm going to be around for a while" potentially, or long-term promises. But as a president, you also have a narrow window, as we shall see, to do all of these things. So let's first of all consider when the president tries to win over people. He's actually got three audiences he has to keep in mind, right? He has to design or tailor his messaging depending on his audience, right? You got to know your crowd. There are three audiences that the president must concern himself with. The first, and usually most important to be quite honest, are politicians and leaders, primarily in D.C., right? The D.C., the Beltway crowd. As Richard Neustadt pointed out in his book Presidential Power, a president's reputation among his Washington colleagues is of great importance in affecting how much deference his views receive, and thus how much power he can wield. And he went on to explain, if a president is thought to be smart and sure of himself and cool and shrewd and effective, he will be effective. Roosevelt had that reputation. Lyndon Johnson had that reputation, at least early on. Other presidents, not so much. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, for example, they did not show up with a good rep, and so that hurt them. I would argue that has been one of the problems for Donald Trump. He had a reputation. He doesn't even have an established reputation. Let's say it that way, because he's got two reputations, right? He's a businessman. He's been around. He's a developer. This, that, the other. Now, obviously, some people say, well, yeah, he's got a history of using bankruptcy law to his advantage, whatever. I'm not going to worry about that. He's got a reputation as a businessman, but then he had that whole apprentice TV personality persona thing going on too, right? Like he'd morphed into that. No offense to Donald Trump, that's not exactly the material that great presidencies are built on, at least the initial reaction, right? I am not passing a judgment on his ability to be president, but what I'm trying to do is highlight what I just said. The perception amongst the political class, the leaders, right? When you walk in, that's important, right? Because it basically determines whether they're even going to give you an opportunity or not, right? So that is something you have to keep in mind, though. You've got this audience that's going to judge you immediately. They're not even going to give you a chance. And, they have different expectations and they play by a different game, or different set of rules, I guess I should say. The second audience that a president must concern himself with are party activists and those that hold non-federal office. So basically, the governors, more important, state legislators, people that run the various political action committees or interest groups, those folks. These are the people that the president basically has got to win over to build that truly national constituency, so to speak, right? You've got to speak to the people of coal country, for example, using one from the 2016 election. Donald Trump, on that campaign trail, he courted that coal vote. Hillary Clinton clearly burned that bridge. And he courted it, right? That's a unique group of governors, a certain region of the country. You've got certain interest groups that are involved here, right? And so that's a different class. And these are the people who are looking for the fire and brimstone, for the speeches. These are the people who are looking for those promises that don't maybe make sense to other parts of the country, or that's where the president or the person campaigning might get themselves in a little bit of trouble in the long run, because they're going to make all these promises to all these different groups, and then it's like, how do you deliver? And then the third audience is the public at large. But again, this is multiple publics, right? And this might be where actually that coal metaphor goes a little better. Party activists and office holders outside of Washington, You're talking just about, the Republican Party across America, right? You're talking about Republicans in the East and in the West, and Republicans in Nebraska. When I talk about the public, you got to realize you're talking about all sorts of different groups, right? You're not just talking to America. You're talking to rural America. You're talking to poor America, or industrial America, or Rust Belt America, or you're talking to minorities, or you're talking to white America, whoever you're talking to, right? There are a bunch of different publics. There are all these little groups, these constituencies that the president has got to appeal to. And that's the thing. A president on the campaign trail is gonna try and speak to these groups, right, and win them over. Now, your book notes, a president on the campaign trail speaks boldly. A president in office is very quiet. And of course, everybody kind of complains about all this talk, all these promises, and no delivery. I do have to point out that presidents learn very quickly that basically they are more than likely going to say something wrong. It's so easy to stick your foot in your mouth. It's so easy to misspeak, or to not use just the right phrasing, right? And then you've got to backtrack and you've got to explain, and your overall message gets lost in people nitpicking and ripping apart the details, right? And that is why it's amazing presidents talk once they get elected. To be quite honest, if I was president, why would you ever grant an interview? Right? Why? Think about it. That reporter, I don't care who they're with, right? They are looking to make a story. And there's no better story on the face of the earth than the reporter who caught the president, right? The reporter who tripped up the president, the reporter who made the president look like a fool, right? Why? Why would you take that chance? Even if the reporter's a friendly reporter, you could accidentally trip yourself up and dig yourself a hole, right? And no one's going to help you dig out of it. As your book noted, presidents have made fewer and fewer impromptu remarks since the years of FDR, and instead they rely more on prepared speeches, which are basically, very sanitized and very polished, and they are refined to prevent those little missteps and miscues and open to interpretation and all that other stuff. Again, that's why Donald Trump is a little bit of enigma in that sense, or breaking the rule. He's got a teleprompter sometimes, not always. We know he doesn't always have a teleprompter because he says things that presidents don't say. Not just that. It doesn't come off as something that a political speechwriter would have written. Okay? It's not the usual language. Some of the things that are said are things that honestly just won't work, right? You're digging a hole. Not to pick on him, but in general, you want a good example, look at debates, right? In debates where in the heat of the moment you got to try and say something and you got to answer the question and somehow zinger your opponent, but you can't look stupid and you can't dig yourself a hole. Debates are a great example of why politicians don't like doing impromptu speaking, right? Because you get caught. Even when you try to tell the truth, you get in trouble, right? Herbert Hoover and FDR held 6 or 7 press conferences each month. But every president from Nixon through Clinton held barely one a month. They basically averaged one a month. That's it. We went from 6 or 7 a month to one a month. And if you think about it, it's gone to where the president doesn't actually speak to reporters, generally speaking. It's their press secretary, right? Presidents have gone to where they don't want to say it because they know it's not going to go well. Now, some presidents do this, though, as I said. Teddy Roosevelt liked to call it the bully pulpit, the idea of you could use the fact that you are the president, and when you speak, people have to pay attention. No one can basically refuse you speaking. And it's always covered, and it's always in everybody's ear, whether they like it or not. And it's a phrase meaning that you have the ability, whether people like it or not, they have to hear you. They can't tune you out. They can't ignore you. And Teddy Roosevelt loved that. First of all, he was very charismatic, very dynamic speaker. That was his great gift. And he loved to use the office of the presidency to basically force his way into the newspapers. But moving on to the next aspect. Okay, so obviously being a popular president is very helpful. Okay, popularity though is not the end all be all. It's not. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to get exactly what you want. This is where that whole concept of, people get elected independently. Yeah, you're part of a party. You represent a political party. You might receive funding and support from a party, but at the end of the day, you're on your own, right? The party can't get you elected. You got to get yourself elected. And so that's why, even if a president is stupendously popular, it doesn't mean that you're going to be popular. We had an example of that in our own backyard. The president won the state of Kentucky by a wide margin in the 2016 election. Matt Bevin lost the governor's race. Even though Donald Trump came to town and, did a few rallies for him and spoke on his behalf, etc., the popularity of a president does not guarantee that a person's going to get elected to Congress or reelected to Congress or anything like that. As we talked about in Chapter 9, if you're in Congress, you're good. You don't need the president, right? No matter who's in charge, the odds are you're going to keep your seat. We said that the incumbency election rate or the incumbency victory rate in the House of Representatives is around 90%, right? So that means 90% of the House of Representatives is going to get reelected no matter who wins in 2020, okay? It's always that way, generally speaking. Democrat or Republican, they're going to keep their jobs. And yeah, there is a factor of coattails. Obviously, 2016 was a Republican wave, and a bunch of Republicans kind of rode the Trump train to victory. But even then, political scientists look at that and will argue that there are limiting factors. But there's a growing degree of insulation where the presidential election does not affect the congressional elections, right? Near as much as some people like to think. So the idea of I'm going to support the president because it's going to help me get elected or help me keep my job, not necessarily the case. Right? Now, a president's popularity, though, does have an effect on how much of his stuff Congress will pass. It doesn't affect elections that much, but it does affect what's going to be voted on, what's going to be on the legislative agenda, and how well it's going to go through, right? How much of the president's stuff is actually going to get done. What it comes down to is members of Congress understand that while the president can't remove them from office, failure to support widely popular programs that are being backed by a widely popular okay, I said that wrong. Programs that are being widely touted and supported and pushed by a very popular president, you are in dangerous waters if you go against that, right? If the man said, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and the guy's approval ratings are super high and he's really popular and everybody likes him, and then you're going to stand up and say, yeah, I think X, Y, and Z are terrible ideas, you're saying to the American people who by a wide margin have said they support this guy and his ideas, yeah, I don't agree with you, right? That's not good politics. And so it makes a lot of sense for members of Congress to, if a president's very popular, they're going to kind of get on with his program. They're going to support it to some degree. There is some reality to coattails, politically speaking. If a guy's really popular and he's got this agenda and he ends up staying kind of popular and you voted for his agenda, you can put that in your campaign when you run for re-election. You're good to go. Now, one other thing you have to think about is it's not just numbers. Okay, that's the other thing. And this is one of those kind of things where if you asked me if a president was successful, right? We've talked about this previously. I've mentioned it in previous videos. If you were to ask me if this president, you rattle off a president, is this president a success, or would you consider this president a success? And then I would do my usual where I go, well, how do you define success, right? This is where we have to ask ourselves something, okay? First of all, are we going to score everything equal? Is a major piece of legislation, does that equal 20 little things, right? I mean, how do you balance them out? Because here's a great example. Obamacare. Barack Obama, first term, really, only thing he accomplished, Obamacare. Okay? And I'm saying that just as an honest, it's the only big ticket item that the guy got through. Okay? That's it. That's really all he got through. He burned every bit of political clout he had getting that thing through. Okay? But that was his baby, right? That was his key objective. That was, his promise. He got it through. He didn't get anything else through. So then you have to ask yourself, is that guy a success or a failure? I mean, he only got one big thing through, but it was a pretty big thing. And that's all he got through, right? You got to ask yourself that sort of question when you do these measurements. If he's successful on a lot of small things and never on a big one, is that a success? I mean, that's the other thing you got to think about. You got some presidents, they'll never go after the big thing because they don't want to go through that fight, or they don't think they'll win that fight. So what do? They rack up a lot of little victories, right? Nothing New Deal-ish, like nothing that's going to be written about in the history books. But they got a little of this and a little of that and a sprinkling of this stuff that, dorks who study political science hardcore, or maybe people who are trying to write a biography about a president might know, but the average Joe's never going to know it, right? It's stuff that's buried in the congressional record. Is that success? I mean, is that guy really popular and getting it done if he just picks a bunch of fights that basically aren't even fights? They're guaranteed wins. That's the thing. A president can keep his victory rate very high by never going after controversial matters, right? President Carter made his views known on only 22% of the bills that went before the House when he was president. Eisenhower, on the other hand, he came out and voiced his opinion 56% of the time. Right? So Jimmy Carter basically only stood up and spoke his mind a little over 1/5 of the time. Meanwhile, Dwight Eisenhower more than half the time said how he felt on matters, right? So he kind of put his neck out there a little more. He voiced his opinion a little more, which means he has more of a chance to fail. Another thing you have to think about, too. A president can appear successful if a few of the things he pushes for get passed, but most of his stuff never actually gets out of Congress and never gets voted on. He can do the whole, I got some of it done, but you know how it is in Washington, and the bureaucracy and the opposition party and this and that and the other. So my point is, this is one of those when you want to measure how successful is he and how important is popularity. There are so many factors and variables, it makes it very hard to get an accurate score, or at least a score that I think you can compare to another president. They're kind of all individuals facing different circumstances, and they all play by different rules, so to speak, or they have different game plans. One other thing, presidential popularity is very hard to predict. Before you sit there and try and draw some conclusions off of popularity and effectiveness and things of that nature, popularity is not always in the hands of the president. For one, President George W. Bush, his approval rating when he took office was 57%, identical to what Bill Clinton had when he first took office. Well, nearly. 57 for George W. Bush, 58 for Bill Clinton. So when Bill Clinton took office in 1993, he had 58% approval. George Bush had 57%. I want to point out, George Bush won a very cantankerous election that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He actually didn't win a majority of the American popular vote, So this guy's got a 57% approval rating. He had the highest disapproval rating of any president since we began tracking that number. But within 6 months, his approval rating shot through the roof. Why? September 11th. September 11th, and the way he conducted himself and handled himself, and you guys weren't around for it, but I mean, I watched it, man. He's standing on chunks of rubble, talking to rescue workers through a bullhorn. He's landed on aircraft carriers and talking about mission accomplished. He's doing all sorts of stuff, right? Really inspiring presidential stuff. He's given speeches, creating Homeland Security. That wasn't part of a master plan. He was reacting to circumstances that he was able to use to his advantage. And I don't want to make that sound like very Machiavellian, but he played it well, okay? He handled it right, and it rose his approval rating dramatically. His approval rating never went below 70% until the latter half of 2002, right? Matter of fact, his approval ratings after the attack were some of the highest ever recorded, around 90%, right? Barack Obama, his approval rating averaged 63% his first 6 months in office, but his popularity decreased below 45% by the midterm elections, right? And the Republicans took advantage of that and took control of the House in the 2010 midterm elections. Obama's approval ratings were in the 45 to 50% range going up to re-election. They were just barely above 50% when he won re-election. By the end of 2013, his approval ratings were back in the 30s. And my point is, he was like the average guy. And it's not because he did anything, bad, good, whatever. I'm not passing judgment on that, but he's like everybody else, right? Here you go, George W. Bush, 9/11. You're welcome, right? But then, look, you did exactly what everybody else did. You slowly slid down, right? You slowly slid down. Some people have a little, waffle, but everybody basically slides down by and large. Little exception here and there. But you can see Obama sliding down, a little recovery right around election time, sliding down, And so it's hard to define popularity. It's hard to control popularity. You can do everything as best as you possibly could. You're still going to lose popularity statistically. So let's look at that. What happens? What is going on? Actually, let's look at this chart for a moment. Here you go. Gains and losses in presidential election years. Generally speaking, when you win the White House, your party is going to pick up seats in Congress, generally speaking, right? So as you can see, in 32, Roosevelt and the Democrats did well. They still did well. Actually, every time that Roosevelt got elected, the Democrats were able to pick up some seats in the House. A little loss in the Senate there, nothing major. Harry Truman. You can see John F. Kennedy is a little exception to the rule. Eisenhower broke even in 56. Kennedy, they lost some seats in the House of Representatives. The Republicans did very well in 1960. But you can see in general, first Clinton's first year of getting elected was that Republican Revolution, when the Republicans were able to take control of the House of Representatives. But in general, there is an actual reality to the presidential coattails in a presidential election year. But hang on. Your popularity as president is going to decline over time. All right? Popularity is an asset that will decline over the course of your presidency, with very, very few exceptions. Okay? Very few exceptions. Why does that occur? All right? Here, let's go back to this. Why does that occur? Well, let's think about it, right? You made promises to everybody and their brother all across the country. And some of them you were never going to be able to keep. And some of them you tried to keep. But you don't make the law. Congress makes the law. And you made the promises, not Congress, right? Start doing the math, guys. Basically, you burn bridges, you fail to fulfill a promise, you anger a constituency, you make a decision certain people don't like, and you're going to slowly but surely lose, right? Popularity. It happens to all of them, basically. Again, you have hiccups. There are events and moments that might reverse the course, but by and large, you're gonna start to slide down, right? You're gonna start to fall down. Let's see, Lyndon Johnson, there was a little bit there in early '68 where he was doing better, but then the wheels fell off. He wasn't able to reverse it. Trying to think of something off the top of my head that would explain some of these. This was just the economy slowly beginning to recover. There you go, if you're curious. What happened with Obama? The economy began to slowly recover around this point, which helped out with his popularity a little bit. But anyhow, I don't want to get too bogged down in looking at that. You're going to lose popular support. Between inauguration and the time you lose office, you're going to lose popular support, right? Every president except Eisenhower, Reagan, and Clinton basically just went down, right? They never came back. As you can see, Eisenhower had that spike in early '60 and was able to maintain enough momentum to ride out. But my point is, he was able to kind of go out roughly really close to where he came in. Clinton, similarly, actually, interestingly enough, he basically went out the same popularity he came in with, and Reagan did roughly the same, right? They're the only ones who really were basically where they started. Everybody else is going to finish lower than they started, okay? Why does that happen? Well, Nixon, Watergate, Harry Truman, the Korean War situation, Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. That was pretty much the end of his days. Jimmy Carter, failure to save our hostages in Iran. George H.W. Bush, a recession. George W. Bush, the war in Iraq, right? There's always something that kind of whittles away your popularity. Now, most people talk about that honeymoon period. Right after the election is when you're going to be at your most popular. So that's when you need to get moving. That's when, if you're going to push for something, push for it, right? Roosevelt's 100 days. That was in some ways like the greatest example of a president utilizing the honeymoon period, right? Just firing off legislation, playing off your humongous victory in the election, and the pressure that you were able to wield on Congress and getting it done. But that's an exception to the rule. Again, I do not like using Roosevelt's 100 days to compare to any president. I don't think it's remotely fair. But other presidents in more normal times, while there's a honeymoon, they don't enjoy such power in their honeymoon. I mean, yeah, there's that brief period where everybody kind of plays nice. But it's not like you get a Congress who just says yes to everything that you propose. Harry Truman had little success. Eisenhower, he didn't really do a whole lot, so he didn't test the waters. Kennedy, Nixon, Ford, Carter had a few victories in their first year, but nothing that you could call a honeymoon. Matter of fact, John F. Kennedy struggled mightily to get things passed because he angered Southern Democrats when on the campaign trail he talked about civil rights. Lyndon Johnson is really the only person that had a very good relationship with Congress in a honeymoon period and immediately after. And I would argue that was in part because he was replacing the martyr, if you will, of John F. Kennedy. And also, Lyndon Johnson was an incredibly gifted politician with a background in the legislature that's second to none, right? Ronald Reagan had a number of victories in his first year, but his second year in office, he struggled. So a lot of people, there's that first year where you have some victories, and after that, it's going to be an uphill fight. And that is why you're going to have the midterm problem, right? Ever since 1934, in every off-year election with two exceptions, the president's party has lost seats in one or both houses of Congress. That's right, in every single midterm, except for two. You lose seats, okay? 1936, 1934. So that was when we start this, right? So go beyond 1934, and here you go. Here's where the chart is goofy. Here's your zero line. Their zero line needs to be up higher. I don't know who made these charts. Look at that. 1938, Roosevelt lost in both the House and the Senate. Truman the same. Here's some exceptions to the rule. John F. Kennedy in 1962 picked up seats in the Senate, but he still lost a few seats in the House of Representatives. The exceptions to the rule are George W. Bush in 2002. He picked up one or two in the Senate, and he picked up a few in the House. And Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton in 1998 broke even in the Senate, if I remember correctly, and he picked up a couple in the House. That's it. Outside of that, you're always losing seats in one or both houses of Congress in a midterm. Okay? And for those of you who are going, what's the deal with that? I'll get back to this chart in a moment. What is the deal with that? Well, let's think about it. I just got done telling you that your first year, you have some success, but that starts to run out after your honeymoon is over, and you fail to deliver on some promises, and you anger some groups with some of the decisions that you make, and this and that and the other. And here you go, presidential victories, percentage of victories. You'll notice, Eisenhower, during his presidency, loses his ability to get things he wants in Congress done. And then Johnson, everybody starts to lose. Because again, you basically have to, you burn political clout. As your popularity wanes, your ability to influence Congress wanes, right? And then, in the midterm, basically, they're able to say, well, he didn't deliver. They call you a liar. They call you ineffective. They point out every time that you failed to do what you said you were going to do, right? And so that's how the opposing party is able to nibble away. Now, here you go. In 1998, Democrats won 5 seats in the House and lost none in the Senate, so they broke even in the Senate. And in 2002, Republicans gained 8 in the House and 2 in the Senate. That's the only exception to the midterm decay. You saw it recently, gentlemen. In 2018, the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives, and the Republicans maintained control of the Senate. I think they might have even picked up a seat. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the trend continues, even for Mr. Trump. Now, the president, gentlemen, might not have the ability to enact legislation, but he does have the ability to stop legislation, or at least try to. The veto. The Constitution does give the president the power to veto. Now, also the president has the power of executive privilege, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's talk about the veto. If the president disapproves of a bill, he has the ability to veto it. He can veto in one of 2 ways. One is by way of a veto message. It is a statement that the president sends to Congress accompanying the bill that they sent to him. This must be done within 10 days, not counting Sundays, after the bill has been passed. So if a bill gets passed in Congress, the president has basically 11 days to veto it. Because if you think about it, there's going to be a Sunday in there, right? You take any chunk of 10 days, there's going to be a Sunday. So make it 11 days. The president has 11 days to veto it. If he doesn't veto it, it becomes a law, right? Now, what does he do in his veto message? He explains why he's vetoing it. Right? He justifies his veto. He doesn't say just no, right? He's got to say why he said no. The other method is called the pocket veto. Okay, so the pocket veto. Some of you might remember this from American history because the pocket veto is the method that Abraham Lincoln famously used to prevent the Wade-Davis bill which was a congressional plan for Reconstruction from going into effect in 1864. Okay, so here we go. If a president doesn't sign a bill within 10 days and Congress has adjourned within that time frame, then the bill does not become law. Okay, so basically if Congress passes something within 11 days of Congress going out of session, right, because there's an election or they're taking one of their, massive breaks that they take or whatever, if they pass something in that window near the end of a session and the president doesn't sign it and he doesn't veto it, it just goes away, it dies, right? It's like it never existed. Obviously, a pocket veto only has a very narrow window when it can occur. And actually, I apologize, I said that wrong. It has nothing to do with the break. It only applies to the end of that second session. So basically, when a Congress goes out of session to have an election, right? So there's an 11-day window, 10-day window, every 2 years where a president may pocket veto something. Okay, it's very, 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 very limited. Presidents have pocket vetoed a bill just before Congress recessed for summer vacation. But in 1972, Senator Edward Kennedy protested this, and they changed the rule, and it's now understood that basically there's only one window, right? So back in the day, the pocket veto was that's why I got confused for a moment. I apologize. Back in the day, there were 2 windows for pocket veto. Now there's only one, right? So it literally is when a Congress is about to go out of session permanently in order to go have an election. So there's a very narrow window where you can have a pocket veto. It rarely happens. If you're curious, the last president to pocket veto anything was Bill Clinton. That's right. We haven't had a pocket veto in this country since 1999. George W. Bush never pocket vetoed anything, and neither did Barack Obama, and I am not aware of any pocket vetoes coming out of Donald Trump that last time. So we haven't seen this one come out of the closet in about 20 years now. A bill, enough of that though, a bill that is not signed or vetoed within 10 days becomes law automatically. Without presidential approval. For those of you who are like, why would you not just sign it? It's a way of protesting a bill, but without vetoing it, because if you know that they're going to overturn your veto, you don't want to veto it, because there's nothing more embarrassing than your veto getting overturned, right? So presidents sometimes will refuse to sign a bill as a way of registering their protest against the bill, but they won't actually veto the bill. But hey, let's go ahead and veto a bill. What happens when you veto a bill? The bill goes back to Congress, and 2/3 of each house must vote to override the veto in order to institute the law over the president's veto. A bill that has been pocket vetoed cannot be brought back to life in Congress. And by the way, it doesn't carry over the next session. It has to start all over again. That's right. You remember that flow chart from Chapter 9? You have to go back to step 1, right? So it is like a nail in the coffin. Now, the president must veto, he must either sign or veto the entire bill. Okay, we have to get that clear, and it's something I've hinted at and talked about numerous times in here. Legislation is legislation. It's one big package, right? It's a combo meal, right? And the president either accepts or rejects the combo meal. He can't pick and choose. That's called line item veto. The president does not have line item veto. The idea where he can pick and choose what parts of a bill he wishes to approve and which parts he wants to veto. Congress can take great advantage of this lack of ability. Because if you think about it, what you do is you put something the president, is going to support, right? You put something, take one of his pet projects, put it in a bill, then add a bunch of pork to the bill, stuff he might not like. Make him decide, is he willing to kill his program to prevent your pork? They do it all the time, right? Because again, he can't pick and choose. There have been attempts by presidents to find ways to wiggle, the right or power of line item veto, and it's never been there, okay? In 1996, Congress did pass a bill which the president signed, which gave the president the power of enhanced rescission, which meant a president could cancel parts of a spending bill passed by Congress without vetoing the entire bill. Fun fact, the Supreme Court overturned this and said, no, that's basically line item veto. And you can't line item veto, even if it's just a spending bill. No line item veto. So I'm sorry, Mr. President, you still don't have line item veto. Okay? Now, just because we don't have line item veto doesn't mean veto is not powerful. Congress rarely is able to override a veto because you need a 2/3 vote, right? And rarely, if ever, does one party in Congress have, or one ideological branch of a party, have a 2/3 majority. From George Washington to Barack Obama, more than 2,500 vetoes were cast by presidents. Only 4% of those were overridden. Okay? So only about 4% have been overridden. If you are curious who holds the record for number of vetoes, well, coming in first place, Franklin Roosevelt. Coming in second place, little known Cleveland. And a lot of people are unaware that Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower are taking the bronze, and there is no medal for fourth place. So Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Grover Cleveland hold the records for vetoes. And for those of you who haven't noticed, Cleveland is actually 2 columns, gentlemen, because he was a non-sequential president. And so, sorry, I had a brain fart for a moment. These 4 men account for 65% of the vetoes in presidential history. So of the 40-plus presidents we've had, 4 of them account for 65% of all the vetoes. Some people barely use the veto. And I'm not talking about the early presidents. Look at some of these guys down the line. George W. Bush did not veto a single bill in his first term. He did issue 12 vetoes in his second term, 4 of which were overturned. Ouch. Oftentimes, if a veto is, oftentimes the president gives a veto, the legislation will be revised by Congress and passed in a more suitable form. If it's the kind of, and that's where that signing or the veto statement's important. The president says, here's what I don't like. And then Congress will sit down and go, okay, we'll make the additions or changes that he wants, right? And they'll get it through that way. Now, another thing about the president we need to talk about, another powers. We got the veto, executive privilege. What is executive privilege? The Constitution says nothing about whether the president has to divulge private communications between himself and his advisors, but presidents have claimed what we call executive privilege, a certain confidentiality. Again, it is not guaranteed in the Constitution, but it is an understood concept that the president must have a certain level of confidentiality and privacy. It's based on 2 statements or 2 concepts. The doctrine of the separation of powers means that one branch of government does not have the right to get into the internal workings of another. So the president has the right to talk to members of the executive branch and not talk to people in the legislative branch about it, right? And vice versa. Secondly, there is the concept that statecraft requires the president to have the right to have confidential advice. The president needs to be able to talk to people and get their honest opinion and know that they're not going to repeat what he said to the Washington Post, right? I mean, how's a president supposed to do anything if he can't have any confidential conversations? Now, for almost 200 years, there was no real challenge to the claim of presidential confidentiality. We never needed it, right? The courts never really ever needed a president to answer questions. That was until 1973. Actually, in 1962, a Senate committee explicitly accepted a claim by President Kennedy that his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was not required to divulge the identity of Department of Defense officials who had censored certain speeches by generals and admirals. So there was actually a committee hearing in 1962 where, the president was like, we don't have to answer anything you guys ask us. And the Senate was like, all right, fine. Right? And then in 1973, we had to change the way we did business because in 1973, we had Watergate. And as it spiraled from the beginnings of Watergate, by 1974, the Supreme Court was handed a case. Federal special prosecutors were looking for tape recordings of conversations and phone calls in the White House by Richard Nixon and some of his advisors. And Richard Nixon wouldn't turn over the tapes. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the case of United States v. Nixon, the Supreme Court held in a vote of 8-0 that while there may be a basis for executive privilege, diplomatic matters, military secrets, etc., that there was no, quote, absolute unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. Basically, you can't just claim executive privilege just because you're president doesn't mean you have absolute secrecy or confidentiality. Just because you're president doesn't mean you're immune from prosecution or investigation, and that your advisors are completely immune from it. Nixon had to hand over the tapes and the papers, and as we all know from our American history, that's partially what got the president burned. The idea was that the judge could then decide what was relevant and allow that information introduced in the case. The rest would be kept confidential. Now, is there a chance that we might reverse this opinion? It's possible. In 1997 and 1998, we had yet another case involving a president, this time Paula Jones, who claimed that President Bill Clinton had tried to solicit sex from her. Federal courts, though, held that held that the president that she tried to press a lawsuit. I'm getting ahead of myself. In his defense, his lawyers claimed executive privilege for the Secret Service agents. Federal courts held that, not only could the president be sued, but these officials could not claim executive privilege, right? So they're like, you can claim executive privilege, Mr. President, and some of your advisors, but your bodyguards can't. We have every right to ask your bodyguards if that woman was in the room. It's not a secret, right? She's not a minister. She's not a general. She's not an ambassador, right? So there's no executive privilege in us asking your bodyguards if a certain person was in the White House at a given time if it's not government secret. An unhappy result of this is presidents are finding that their circle of confidential advisors has grown very small because it's basically become a very narrow window of who is held in confidence and in what situations. Now, another thing that presidents have tried, and it's become one of those gray areas, is what is called impoundment of funds. Richard Nixon was a big fan of this one too, by the way. Over time, presidents have tried to refuse spending money appropriated by Congress. Harry Truman did not spend all that Congress wanted to spend on the armed forces. President Johnson, for example, did not spend all of the money that was set aside for highway construction. Thomas Jefferson impounded funds. I mean, the presidents have done this from time to time. But there's an issue. While the Constitution is silent on whether the president must spend the money that Congress appropriates, it does say that the president cannot spend money that Congress has not appropriated. Okay? And so here we go, Richard Nixon. Nixon wanted to reduce the amount of federal spending. And again, this is one of those things you might remember from your American history. Richard Nixon wanted to basically replace federal programs with state programs, right? He called it New Federalism. The idea was we would take all these programs from the federal domain and put them in the state domain, and the states would take care of all these things, and the programs would be smaller and more efficient, and because one size doesn't fit all, as we already learned in this class. Okay. Well, Richard Nixon proposed in 1972 that Congress basically give him the ability to reduce federal spending, and he was going to kick money to all these other programs, etc. Congress refused, and so Nixon responded by pocket vetoing 12 spending bills and then refusing funds that had been appropriated and such. Congress, in turn, passed the Budget Reform Act, which required the president to spend all appropriated funds unless he first tells Congress what funds he is not wanting to spend, and then Congress gives 45 days to go over it, etc., etc. Federal courts on this matter have upheld the rule that the president must spend money that Congress has appropriated. Okay? The idea that the president can delay it for a review period, those 45 days of review, right? But he can't prevent it. After that 45-day window where he theoretically has a chance to talk to Congress and work with them and explain why he doesn't want to do this or how he thinks the money could be better spent, after those 45 days, you got to write the check. You don't have a choice, Mr. President, right? So we have, as of 1974, impoundment is only a temporary holding of the funding. The president cannot completely withhold the federal funds. This is where the matter of sanctuary cities kind of comes up a little bit. We talked about this a couple of years when I first started teaching this class. Because students asked about it, and I pointed out, if you really want to get technical, you can't deny those cities the federal funds if the money has already been set aside for that funding. You would have to change the funding rules. But anyhow. And one last topic I'd like to cover before we wrap up this quite lengthy section, I apologize, is signing statements. Since James Monroe, the White House has been issuing statements when the president signs a bill. These statements, gentlemen, are an opportunity for the president to express his opinion on a law, maybe his opportunity to talk about how he plans to implement the law, how the executive branch will help carry out this law, maybe to declare why the president is not exactly thrilled about a certain part of a law, why he might consider a certain part of a law unconstitutional, but of course he won't veto it because it's the will of the people, something like that. President Andrew Jackson, for example, in 1830, when he signed a law that was to build a road from Chicago to Detroit, in his signing statement, he said he did not think that the road should cross the Michigan boundary. Fun fact, the road never did get all the way to Chicago. In the 20th century, signing statements became a lot more common. Reagan issued 71, George H.W. Bush 141, which if you think about the fact he was only president for 4 years, that's quite a lot. Clinton 105. It's become more and more common. Now, Congress doesn't like this because to them, a signing statement is kind of like the president putting his own kind of stamp or tweak on a law, right? The idea is it almost comes off as like a Lineitem Veto in some ways too. If a president says, I'm going to, the executive branch in carrying out or conducting this law, we are going to do this. That's kind of the president changing the law from his desk. At least that's the way Congress looks at it, right? And so Congress is not a fan of signing statements. The Supreme Court has remained silent on the topic. They have not really said a whole lot. It has never given a clear verdict about the constitutionality of signing statements. There was talk by a Democratic Congress of challenging the practice. to try and put that to bed, if you're curious, Barack Obama, shortly after taking office, made it clear he would only use signing statements to voice protest over provisions of legislation he did not agree with. But signing statements are a fact, again, that we've had for coming on, over 200 years now, where presidents kind of take an opportunity to voice their take, opinion, and plans for legislation. In 10.4, we will actually look at the executive branch, the office of the president, and all the folks that come with that. It's a very big White House, and there's more there than just Melania and Don. So we're going to look at, who works in the White House and in and around the White House, who supports the White House. What is the executive branch beyond the president and the vice president? But that is to come in section 4.